Kathy. More people will join us as we progress, but welcome. This is the 17th Catalyst Check-in for 2023. Great to see people jumping on from around the world, some faces that we haven't seen for a while. It's just been that kind of year, I think. I want to acknowledge our traditional custodians, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in Melbourne, and their connections to land, sea and community, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and thank them for their magnificent custodianship and stewardship of this ancient continent and island of Australia. I'm out actively campaigning for the voice to Parliament, as I know many people across the Catalyst Network are. So hopefully through our efforts and multiple conversations across the country, we'll get it across the line. But talking of conversations, we have a few coming up in the Catalyst Network as we race towards the end of the year. Next week in Melbourne, we're going to be joined by Sydney member Elisa Hewkins. Welcome, Elisa, to pick up on this theme of mindsets and beliefs and challenge some of our thinking around how to unpack this. And it's a beautiful sort of follow on from today's conversation, just a different frame. And Elisa's actually done a little bit of research across the Catalyst Network and, you know, brings a wealth of experience. So excited about that. The following week in the afternoon, we've got a Zoom call with Donnelly Patman, who's going to join us from Perth. And she's going to share her story of tackling how she came to tackle the international trade in animal parts, an amazing feat of successful collaboration that got her Australian recognition, and how that's set her up for her next quest, which is to make Australia a centre for global rewilding. One thing led to another, a very emergent sort of approach. On Wednesday, November the 8th, we've got a morning Zoom session with somebody else who's on the call, podcaster and author Ed Brenegar, who was featured in the book, The Neo-Generalists, which again, I know many of you know well, written by our friends Richard Martin and Kenneth Mickelson. Really looking forward to that, Ed. And we'll be back in Sydney for a face-to-face session on Wednesday, November the 15th, pulling apart some of our typical approaches to dealing with complex issues, particularly at a government level, like ageing and the aged care sector. We've been doing some work in housing, taking a very different approach, and there's lots of lessons there around how we might approach these things completely differently. In late November, we have a working session with our friend Mandar Apte, who's the founder of Cities for Peace, former Shell executive. And we're going to be looking at how we can spread the peace virus, is his latest thing. Mandar recently joined an international working group convened by the Doug Hammarskjöld Foundation, exploring ways to bring more young people into peace building activities. So he's a busy individual, keen to get your thoughts on how to bring some of that into what he's doing with the foundation. And our final Zoom session for the year, which is 90% confirmed, fingers crossed, will be joined by the amazing Loredana Paduran, who's an entrepreneur, a professor at Northeastern University in Boston. And she's going to talk about the work behind her book, The Job is Easy, The People Are Not, where she's basically taking on this idea of soft skills, rebranding them smart skills. She's got an amazing backstory as well, really interesting. So hopefully her schedule will enable her to join us. Just a note, tomorrow, if you haven't seen it already, feel free to join the first of 4 conversations over the next few weeks that I'm joining our friend Marty Spiegelman and Todd Hoskin to talk about a different way of living. And some of you were part of the conversation back in May. We're going to dig a bit deeper into some of the themes that came up then. So just email me if you haven't got the link. And then our chat with Greg Bernarda the other week, I did promise to send around a link to the panel discussion with the Thinkers 50 founder, Stuart Craner. It is by invitation, but I do have the link. So if you're interested, it's unfortunately 10 p.m. Sydney time, but suits all the rest of the world. So let me know and I'll send you the link. So we're experiencing some pretty wild weather today in southern Australia, right across at the moment, storms and flooding. I've been hearing the rain outside. So on top of fire warnings across the whole of southern Australia, far earlier than what I've ever experienced. So, but rest assured, if you see a flicker and the power goes off, I've got enough battery on the laptop to keep us going. But it's nature giving us a warning. And, you know, nature's intelligence is something that we have had a number of conversations about in this group. And so today we're going to be looking at strategy through the lens of those lessons of nature and those principles. And I'm really delighted to welcome back Kathleen Allen, a coach, thought leader, and trusted advisor to leadership teams around the world. And as you know, Kathy's spoken to us before about her groundbreaking book, which is one of my all-time faves, Leading from the Roots, which draws key design principles and dynamics from living systems and applies them to leadership and decision-making in organizations. This pioneering work by Kathy gives us a framework that challenges traditional thinking in a really elegant way, I have to say, and creates a new paradigm for leadership that's firmly anchored in the design and the world of nature. So today's Kathy has very generously offered to share her current work with a long-term client on completely rethinking the strategic planning process. And as she explained in the note that I sent around, the CEO reeled her in hook, line and sinker by admitting that he didn't think the organizational mindsets would get them where they needed to go. You know, that's music to all of our ears, right, when someone says that. So Kathy's now in the middle of this living experiment with the CEO and his team, and is about to share some of the early results. So joining us from beautiful St. Clair, Minnesota. Welcome back, Kathy.
Thank you very much. And I've asked Josie if she'd run the slide deck so I can just kind of stay focused. The other thing is that I thought it would be fun to have this a little more conversational. And so I'm also asking Josie to kind of keep track of questions in the chat. And as things come up and you'd like to know more, pop the question in the chat and we will pause along the way to lift those up and see what's resonating with you. That's one of the ways that it helps me bring more contextual response to each of you individually and collectively. So this is kind of where we're starting. So let's go to the next slide. So the real question is, how do we help people evolve the way they're thinking? Because our individual and collective awareness and consciousness is probably going to be one of the differences that will make a huge difference in the future of our world. So I've been using this simple framework from nature, that nature uses information and feedback to help the system evolve. So the whole thing is designed to bring information into the system that then triggers it. So if you think of DNA as a form of information, nature would look at that and say, yeah, DNA is embedded, information is embedded in DNA. And when we went from single cell reproduction to multi-cell reproduction, there was this huge kind of evolutionary jump in the natural world and the evolution of life on our planet. And I've noticed in my own consulting work, you can almost always track dysfunction to the absence of feedback, either because the person who's leading the team doesn't want to hear it or actively avoids it, or people don't feel comfortable sharing what they're really thinking and feeling. So I've been, over the last 5 years, as I've kind of been playing with this design concept from nature, I've been really looking at organizations through the lens of this feedback and information lens. So I often ask the question, what information is missing from the system that if we figured out a way to bring it in, we could help the system shift? And the same thing with feedback. It's a very simple, light touch kind of intervention, is if you can build ways to create more robust feedback loops in an organization, a system, a team, doesn't matter what the context is, it could be a community, then something happens all on its own. So simple touch. And the other thing is that I've recently been playing with and understand what is going on when you bump into people who are in big denial of what's going on in the world. And this person, I ran into her, and I don't know her, I can't remember her name right now, but she's been looking through the neuroscience lens that denial and anxiety is actually a sign that the person who's in denial is having a hard time processing what's going on around them. And so denial is a kind of an active defensive response to slow things down. So then I've been playing with that idea, which is, are there ways to create some kind of roadmap for folks who are having a hard time processing that would allow them to process and move through the current reality and how it's hindering or causing them to be anxious about what they used to believe and what maybe they need to start thinking about. So, so this conceptual roadmap, so it comes with another kind of core belief coming from nature, core design principle, is that our capacity, our organization, and our larger global society's capacity to thrive is going to depend on our ability to see what is changing and proactively adapt. So denial is not going to work. Information is a strong strategy. Feedback is a strong strategy. So that's the basis for this experiment. So you can go to the next slide. So I've been working with conceptual roadmaps for a long time, but I have more recently kind of developed the language around it. So one example is for over 12 years, 13 years, if we count this year, I've been working with the Nebraska Community Foundation, which is a statewide community foundation that builds relationships in rural communities in Nebraska, leveraging community funds and philanthropy to help these communities thrive. And we have, and over that time of 12 years, we have discovered there are certain kind of conceptual frameworks that have really helped the whole system evolve. One of them is this work from Joanna Macy on active hope. So active hope is when you believe, well, helplessness is when you believe nothing's going to change and it's always going to be as bad as it is. Passive hope is when you can see a better future, but you don't believe you have any power or influence to help make that future happen. And active hope is when you can see a better future and you show up, whether you believe you'll make a difference or not, but you show up and act every day in alignment with that better future. So one of the things that we were doing with rural communities is we were helping them shift from this self-defeating prophecy that their communities were going to die at some point in their lifetime to this active hope that the community, can choose an alternative path and shift that self-defeating prophecy to something where they see themselves and their communities thrive. This is where philanthropy helped become an active agent, because having unrestricted endowments gave them financial flexibility to see where they wanted to invest. And we also used here the June Hawley's work on network weaving and how you move from a scattered network to a hub and spoke network to a multi-hub network to a core and periphery where there's more people holding the center than just one hub. And it draws all of the peripheral people who are doing work or adjacent work come closer to that center. And when I first started working in this system, they were in a definite hub and spoke process. So everything went through the mothership and then back out. But what we found is that over time, there were certain concepts that helped the system move from one platform or stage of evolution to the next. And eventually what we've done is we've created a conceptual roadmap for that system, and they now use it to orient every new board member and every new staff member so that everybody stays up to date on these kind of core ideas that have helped shape the system. I do a lot of executive coaching, and I realized that that I have every single one of my clients, I have kind of a conceptual roadmap with them. But the roadmap is very much anchored in their context, their gifts and capacities that they bring, and their ability to, where is their energy and where is their purpose and where is the tension in the system that they're working through as in a kind of strategic change way. And so depending on who they are and what their context is, I basically bring huge, I probably have 1,000 or more concepts in my head at any given time. And I bring those specifically for the moment in kind of a just-in-time way. But what I'm going to talk about today is a deliberate experiment to develop a conceptual roadmap for a leadership team and the board of this particular nonprofit organization. And we did this in multiple rounds on how we could fundamentally help the leadership team and the board members to change the way they are thinking. Trying to figure out, well, what will trigger the change and what concepts have the most power to come in all at once, over, to shift the way they think about their work, their strategy, and their future work. So that's the background. So any questions before we go on?
All good. They're hanging off every word, Kathy.
Okay, well then let's go to the next slide. So I'm thinking, so the conceptual roadmap as a metaphor is, it's really about finding a better map to fit the territory that you're actually driving through or living through. And I took a trip with my sister to Ireland, and we were doing kind of a genealogy tour of various places that my grandfather and grandmother on my father's side came from. And we were sitting in the bed and breakfast after having lost our way from the airport to this particular place, kind of talking over breakfast about how we were going to not get lost quite as often as we had getting there. And a guy who is sitting next to us is, oh, well, you need a better map. You got to go down to this grocery store and buy this map, which tended to be a book that was kind of like 11 by 18 inches and had very, very clear maps of the territory that we're driving in. So when we unpack the metaphor of a conceptual roadmap, we're literally trying to figure out how is it that what ways of thinking can help us see the territory as it actually is, instead of a map that's an approximate or approximation of the territory that you're living in organizationally or in leadership. So that's the framework. So let's go forward. So the purpose is to help us see the territory and connect the dots. This is the helping people process what they're thinking against what's happening in real time. And so it connects the dots between concepts and our reality. So the concepts help us make meaning and of what's going on, and it starts building a deeper and a different kind of coherence in the way we think. And it helps us to collectively make meaning of what's going on. So especially if you're in a meaning-making role in your organization, which could be a team leader, could be an organizational leader, it could be a person who has no formal position, but people go to help them understand what's going on. What happens over time is it starts building coherence in the system, and coherence is one of those things that is necessary for movement to happen. And it provokes and adds knowledge to our ecosystem to help us evolve towards the next level of impact. There's Deborah Rowland. I don't know if any of you have run into her book, Still Moving, but she has 4 major strategies for doing systems change. And one of them is edge and tension work. And so what she does is she brings information in the form of people who tell the truth about what's really happening or who provoke the system, which is an information strategy, in a way that causes people to be disrupted and disturbed. That's why she calls it edge and tension work. But these folks still kind of maintain their role of being able to see the hidden assumptions behind people's thinking and lift up the assumptions so they can be seen and talked about and talked through. Edge and tension work. So a conceptual map can also serve that purpose. Her research says that this edge and tension work is probably one of the highest correlated frameworks or strategies for creating systems change. So what are the powerful concepts? This was basically what the CEO was asking me to do. So we need somebody to come in and disrupt our system and our way of thinking, because he said, I believe that the way we think and the way we operate today will not get us to where we need to operate tomorrow. So he was looking, and I'd done the 2 previous strategic planning frameworks with them, and they are a very effective organization. They just have this ability to accomplish anything they set their mind to. But when I first started with them a little over 10 years ago, they were great at purpose, but they were hard. It was difficult for them to deliver. Now they're great at delivery, and they're great at purpose, but their delivery is too anchored in the complicated world and not enough in the complex world. And they want to drive larger systems change. So that was my task, was how do I help this group see the world differently, evolve their thinking, and help us shape strategy. So that was the whole round. So I've been working for the last 2 months, first of all, with their leadership team, doing individual interviews to collect individual perspectives and see where they were in their thinking, coming back and sharing those themes and patterns anchored in this conceptual roadmap. And then, so we kind of did our first round with the leadership team. And then last week, we did the second round with the board and the leadership team, and coming into building out strategy at the end of that retreat that will be massaged. Are there any questions, Josie?
No, all good, David. Just inquiry about the edge and tension work. Yeah, I'll send that link around with the
still moving. It's a field guide.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's great. All right, if you can go forward then. So what I'm going to do now is just kind of go through what were the conceptual frameworks that I brought to this board and the leadership team, and how did it kind of start to shift the way they were starting to think, and how did it change the way they approach strategy. So this is David Snowden's Cynefin framework. I'm assuming that many of you already kind of know this. So it's simple, complicated, complex, and chaos, or chaotic. And what I've kind of seen in my practice is I see the complicated and simple parts of his framework as anchored in the closed system. So a closed system assumes that variables are known and discoverable, and no new variables come into the system at any given time. So one of the things about so much of our thinking in strategy is that we tend to see the organization as a bounded closed system framework. And that puts us doing strategy from a simple or complicated frame. Complicated is just more variables than the simple. And but also in the world, a lot of the nonprofit organizations I work with, they are very attracted to the language of best practice, but you'll notice that best practice only shows up in closed systems that are relatively simple solutions. And if you want to fundamentally shift to making an impact that is a legacy impact on a region in its economic development, working through entrepreneurs, which is what this organization does, they're no longer in a complicated closed system frame. But some members of their board think about organizations as a bounded system. When you're doing that, things like the SWOT analysis of strengths, weaknesses, threats, opportunities, and threats, that shows up in a non-moving, complicated system. It does not work in a complex system. So we have been taught a lot of things about how to think and work within a territory that is no longer descriptive of our world. And so I was using the Cynefin framework to help evolve the way they were thinking. And if they hadn't run into the difference between complex and complicated, it was a way for me to introduce that concept of open systems, which is, when it's a highly dynamic, new variables appear regularly, there's a lot of flux, movement, dynamicness. So complicated tends to be our default in the way we think about our organization. The board tends to see themselves as circling the wagon of the organization and focusing inward as doing their due governance diligence. But a complex system shifts that metaphor to the board looking more like shifting 90 degrees. So one hand is towards the inside of the organization and the other is reached out into the external environment that allows all of that external sensing of the system to come in and start mixing. And that's kind of helps you match and pace the complexity of the system. So emergent practice in complex systems, the strategy always comes from the pattern rather than the details. So in complicated systems, you analyze, figure out what's not working, and then you build your strategy from the parts up, not from the balcony down. And that is the huge difference. And most organizations who do strategic planning from a complicated framework basically limit, by definition, what they're willing to aspire to. So they can only aspire to something they can accomplish in a 3-year period of time. They can only aspire to strategies that they think they have control over or enough influence that they can accomplish them. So basically, it just squeezes all of our aspirations down into a tiny little short-term frame. And complex systems, actually, you don't have as much control. You can influence the system, but you can't control the system. So your whole relationship to the system is different, which it will be the next concept coming up. So this was really just to introduce it. Now I did have some, everybody could understand the chaoticness, a chaotic system. They all had COVID reactions and frameworks there. But the board chair, for example, said, yeah, but we're in an industry, they do both financial packages for entrepreneurs as well as business services like leadership, management, strategy, tactical and technical advice, etc. But he said, we're in a complicated system and we have a lot of regulations. So most of our work is really complicated. What was intriguing in this exercise was that there were other voices and on the board that once I introduced this difference between complicated and complex, they spent the rest of the day and a half lifting up every complex problem and naming it for what it was as a way to help their board chair kind of connect the dots that actually we're more in the complex frame than we are in the complicated. There are parts of every system that's complicated. Okay, so this was really what this did was it gave other board members and other leadership team folks a language that they could then start describing the open system, the dynamic system of their world. So, and then once it starts showing up, you begin to really see it. When I did this with Nebraska, there was a high resistance to the Cynefin framework initially. But now, you know, within a year, 2 years, the nuances of it became much more clear. And now it's like a core piece of their way of thinking about complex. So, okay, Becky says she introduced this model as a heuristic lens for executive team made up of engineers. And they, and they were prepared to debate every single detail and was not accurate. Okay, that, yeah, engineers will do that for you, Becky. It's like, I come from some of my grandfather was an engineer, so there's a little part of that energy going through my brain as well. Okay, so let's go to the next piece. So what I did after each concept is I went through this framework, which is another conceptual map, which is questions worth asking. So a question worth asking acts as a strange attractor, or a well-packed question is another way to think about this. But I use questions as a way that are not easily answerable, as a way of continuing to engage the brain and the mental framework of sense making after I'm gone from the room and after the retreat is done. And so it's like you lift up questions that can't be answered right off the top of your head, and it allows people to continue to puzzle with them. And then the brain likes to have things kind of figured out. And so what you do is you're starting to take up the real estate of a person's mind to think about things in different ways. So these were some of my questions worth asking to the people in that room. Where it should be, where are we leading in a complicated and complex system? And what does government look like if you are a board member in an organization who's working in a complex system? Because do you govern the same way, a complicated system versus a complex system? And what does organizational leadership look like in a complex system? This is the real challenge for the leadership team, is that they've been framing their work from a complicated frame. But there was energy inside the individual leadership team members who were beginning to see the limits of the complicated framework. And so they became partners in helping to move their leadership team's way of thinking. Next slide. So then living systems. So this is living systems. I'm in the process of trying to figure out what are the powerful metaphors that help people see the livingness of the system and then begin to imagine how to partner with the system. So once you acknowledge that you're in a complex system X% of the time, and perhaps most of the really big work that you want to do as an organization is done in a complex environment, then you have to move to seeing your larger system as a living system. I'm not going to go through all of these, but you know, living systems are interdependent. They become more diverse as they evolve. They're dynamic. They're constantly changing. They're filled with information and feedback. They can't be steered or controlled, but they can be nudged and attracted. It only accepts solutions that the system helps to create, and they only pay attention to what's meaningful. So I've been playing with the difference between a motorboat and a sailboat as a conceptual metaphor to help people see and feel and taste and touch the livingness of the system. So in a motorboat, you know, you basically get in the boat, you can learn how to turn on the motor, how to steer it, and basically you head off to your direction. You have full control, other than, you know, when you have small craft warnings going on outside the system or something like that, where it says you should get off the lake. And interestingly enough, most of our onboarding strategies are onboarding people to teach them how to do a motorboat frame. But a sailboat, especially one that has no motorboat attached to it, you have all of these dynamics that are in relationship. First of all, you can't move the boat without wind. You have to be able to, so you're constantly, noticing where is the wind coming. You're using the intelligence from the sailor, the captain of the boat, to figure out, okay, what direction is the wind coming from? What do the waves look like? Where do I want to go? Where should I place my sail in relationship to this external power source? You're not in control, but your intelligence, the design of the boat, the ballast, the small adjustments that you make as wind shifts, it's very much more of a metaphor of a living system, and you get better and better and better the more you practice it. So I have a friend from the UK who sails every summer, and I asked him in his races that he goes on, does he know any sailor that's always doing about 5 to 20 yards ahead of everybody else under the same conditions? And he said, yeah, I do know a guy like that. And he says, I have no idea what he does, but he has this ability to read the system in a way, the wind, the variables, in a way that he always catches the next wind shift better than anybody else who's sailing that day. And so I think that as we get more and more skilled at actively partnering, intentionally partnering with the livingness around us, that we do better in systems change. Let's go next one. So this is a different kind of, this is actually an engineering story, Becky, you might enjoy this. So there's, I live on the Mississippi River, about 200 miles south of the headwaters. And George Eads was an engineer from the 1800s in the US, and he and the Army Corps of Engineers competed up and down the Mississippi River to solve engineering problems that were cropping up. Could be a bridge, could be other kinds of things. But then the city of New Orleans asked both of them to compete against the problem that they had of silt buildup in the Mississippi River Delta. So they wanted the silt removed in some way, shape, or form so boats could come up out of the Gulf of Mexico and get up above the Delta and then, do commerce up and down the Mississippi. So the Army Corps of Engineers suggested, well, let's just build a canal along the edge of the Delta, and we'll dredge it, and then it will constantly be open for the ships to go up through that canal, and then they'll reach above the Delta and keep going. And George had a different idea. He said, why don't we build levees, down the core of the Delta, and then we'll use the natural energy of the direction that the river is already flowing towards gravity, and we will accelerate that through these levees, so it will create kind of a riptide effect and accelerate the water flow through the center and lift the silt and move it out farther into the Gulf. And then what happened was that New Orleans chose the canal instead of George's idea, but George was so committed to the idea that he got private funding to experiment with it and see if it would work. So both systems worked, but both systems underestimated something. So this is like over 140 plus years ago. The canal still exists, and they're still dredging it every single year, multiple times. So it's an expense but the solution did not see anything in the river, the living system, as something that would actually help people solve the problem. They saw the living system as an enemy, and they had to control all of those variables so they could create a solution, which is actually how many of the ways we think exists. George's system he thought it would take 6 months to solve the problem, but it actually took closer to 12 months. So twice what he thought. But if they would have used his system, there would be probably more levees built over time. But what they would have done is they would have solved it in a sustainable way. And you wouldn't have had all of this additional biannual expense of dredging the canal. So this is an example of, so from this story, I think it was on the National Geographic or the History Channel, I can't remember which, but it just pinged my brain. And I began to see that this was an example of how George saw the livingness of the system. And he wanted to partner with the system instead of try to see the system as an enemy that he had to control and create a bounded world around. So let's go to the next slide. So then it was really George's story that caused me to start thinking about how his solution changed the leadership questions and how the Corps of Engineers solution was more traditional in the way we saw leadership. So in leadership in the canal world, it's what do I need to control? But in George's world, it was what interactions can make this work. So the living system invited you to be in relationship to all of the different moving variables in a way that could increase your influence. And instead of who's going to do this, who do I put in charge to make this happen, get this done? It's what do I unleash? And so he was trying to unleash the energy of the system to serve the solution. And instead of how do I shut down or overcome resistance, that's the canal, right? He was asking, how do I welcome and utilize resistance to actually increase the speed of the change? So those were the levies. And instead of how do I fix the individual, the smallest part of the problem, George is trying to figure out how do I influence the whole field, meaning the whole delta, the whole ecosystem around it. And instead of how do I create change because the system is static, he was asking how do I transform the energy that's already in the system to create change? So what are the solutions? So then here are the questions. So what happens when we assume that we're not the only ones shaping the system we want to influence? Many people in the organizations I work with who come from a more mechanistic frame instead of a living system frame assume that they have to do everything to create, to meet mission or purpose or highest possibility. But those with the living system realize that they are not the only people that are shaping the system. And if we design actively with the system in mind, we can start to transform the system with the help of the system. What if the living system is also actively shaping our possibilities and constraints? And what if it could help us achieve a greater impact if we partnered with it intentionally? Those of you who are gardeners probably can think of a living system. You know, we don't sit around watching a seed germinate. We trust that the seed knows how to germinate on their own. That's a part of the gardening, farming kind of metaphor. So, any questions that we need to lift up, Josie, before?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Just people are commenting as they go along, but I think you'll have a few questions at the end. And the farming metaphor, Becky, we'll have to hear from Becky.
Okay, great. And I love, Stephen, your observation that admitting that you don't have control is a big hurdle. And I think it is. It's like, we have been taught the mythology and the illusion that if you have enough power and positional power and resources, and you can basically control everything, but it is fundamentally an illusion. And so helping people connect the dots and work through and process that is huge. But once you make that simple shift, all kinds of things shift as a result. What surprised you as the leaders in the board considered and danced with these concepts? Great question, Becky. So the people I was working with are in the north eastern section of Minnesota. It's primarily rural. It's right next to Lake Superior, so the north shore of the lake is right next to it. Many of them have experiences living, and even if they're in Duluth, which is kind of city, still considered outstate in Minnesota, but they have this rural nature kind of connection. So for me and for them, what was surprising was the ease at which they saw the livingness out of their own experiences of being in nature. And so it was, but what it did for our strategic framework was they began to more actively think as they built their strategy to see how they could be in relationship, and what was the strategic frame that could move them forward on multiple directions. So one of them was, well, maybe what we really need to do is pay attention to how we weave the network of our region to each other and their communities. And if we created a more robust network, could that in and of itself unleash a whole bunch of energy and direction towards what we're trying to do in the region, as opposed to previously, what do we need to do to make this happen? So that was kind of one of their shifts coming out of this conversation. So then I shared this the last time I spoke, but this wasn't the next conceptual map. So we had Cynefin, questions worth asking, living systems, and then resilience. So this goes again to the thrivability of and future framework of getting them to the present future, not just the present past. And resilience was a way to help them start aspiring to seeing their organization 10, 20, 50, 100 years down the road, and think about what it is still possibly doing and impacting in that region. And so they began to ask the question of, which I would kind of say is a deeper question that helps them think about their system and their organization, not as a closed system, but as a system that is moving, dynamic, evolving. And what we want for our organization isn't just that it makes ends meet, or it comes with a positive balance that can be used, and those resources can be used to further their work. But are they designed, and can they continue to evolve and thrive into the future? So I use these 7 resilience principles, like strengthening diversity and redundancy, connectivity, slow variables and feedback, not just the fast variables. This is the soil to the harvest. The soil is the slow variable, and the polycentric governance is the frame of a network leadership as opposed to a hierarchical primary leadership. So I went through these, and if you could go to the next slide, this was the question. I'll go to the question in the chat in a minute. So what I did is I just lifted up a few of these resilient pieces that boards don't usually think about, like, what are the critical redundancies that your organization needs to pay attention to? In a plane, you have 3 different ways to get landing gear down. In case the first one fails, you have 2 backups. That's a critical redundancy. Boards usually get to this only when they begin to think that their CEO might be retiring soon, and then they start bringing in succession planning, and then that's what they would define as critical redundancies. But there are other critical redundancies in every single system, and if you're not paying attention, then you're not going to be resilient. And then what connections within the organization and within the region and our stakeholders do we need to nourish and expand? That's the connectivity of resilience. And then this was the other question I asked, which what are the slow variables that the organization needs to invest in to be resilient in its future? And so the slow variables are things that boards don't usually pay attention to from a strategy standpoint because they're not fast variables. They're not measuring productivity. They're not measuring goal accomplishment. They're not measuring, all of these kind of typical things that boards pay attention to. And so this, again, was a way of helping them go deeper into the system and try to figure out, oh, what else should we be paying attention to that we're not, kind of geared to pay attention to? And so this led to slow variable conversation. In this case, we went around and talked about, they picked which question, and then we did a round robin and started to surface stuff. And so they started talking about, well, maybe we need to train our staff in a deeper, more, kind of integrated, holistic way. Because right now they had kind of some silo knowledge, but not an integrated knowledge. And they were beginning to notice that their entrepreneurs needed an integrated, holistic approach to finance and services, as opposed to a separate approach. And so it got them into these kind of beautiful, deep other pieces. Ed says our perspectives are so, yes, I'd love to do that, Ed. Yeah, so living systems complex requires so many parts. So it's an incredible skill to hold them all at once as possibilities. People, ops, space, direction, emotions, physical presence, actions, help, empowering. Yes. So, so Trish, this is the thing. Yeah, examples, you were the examples, like whether it's from the New Zealand elections or real-time kind of ways to describe this, helps people put it into a real-time thing. It's not a head thing, it's not a conceptual thing. And so stories, metaphors, I think really help. Examples help. And that it helps in an even stronger kind of way than just talking about them without those deeper examples, because culture for me is a slow variable. Talent and people development is a slow variable, but all natural systems have a very strong bent on development. So how do we help people and invite them? The resilience frame is actually a way to invite some of these deeper, more important questions. But you'll notice Cynefin, complex, living systems, connectivity, and resilience, these are all framing the same flow of interdependence and dynamic system. And trust, curiosity, belief, yes. Yeah, and Amanda, yeah, it starts, so trust, curiosity, belief, those are also variables too. Trust doesn't come quickly. It's so a lot of what we might kind of call the intangible things, the soft skills. I think one of your coming speakers will talk about that. They are all, they become the slow variables of the system that define the possibilities and the constrictions of the system. Yeah, the softer topics of culture, stories, anecdotes. Yes, so the numbers thing is actually, you have to understand it and name it as the default of the system. And that's that's part of the shift in narrative, the shift in story. Storytelling is another conceptual roadmap that sometimes I use. And when you change your story, you change everything. So if numbers is the only thing that your system pays attention to, when you change that story and start talking about slow variables and resilience, most CEOs, most organizations care about whether they'll still be around, X number of years from now. not all, but I work with an airport commission here in Minnesota, and they think in 100-year timeframes. They think that they're in a leadership relay race. So they've inherited the baton from past leadership teams, and they've also inherited all of their decisions. And in real time, they see the limitations and the possibilities. And then their desire is to not hand future problems to the next leadership team if they can help it. And so when you have that longer time frame, what happens, whether it's from a resilience frame or a legacy frame, it doesn't matter. But when you extend your time horizon out, this is another conceptual roadmap. What happens is that what you care about and what you pay attention to and what is important shifts. So you shift to things like investment instead of expenditures. Tillman, we've done artifact making to map the current organizational landscape. Beautiful, brilliant. Yeah, I'd love to talk more about that. That would be super. Okay, let's go because we're kind of, so I've shared this adaptive cycle in the past. So if I were going to bring something in that would be an anecdote to SWOT, which is complicated system kind of strategy, I would use this adaptive cycle as a kind of an aid for strategic thinking. You know, this is something that's been proven in 3.8 billion years of the evolution of nature's system, 3.8 billion years in R&D. So it's a tiny little additional kind of set of expertise and knowledge. So, you know, explore, launch, sustain, release. And it's like an ongoing kind of infinity loop. The two traps are the indecision trap. This is where human systems stop their evolution, is that they are too anchored in their scarcity of resources. And so they don't invest. And they get too, on this side, they fall in love with their forms and that no longer serve purpose, but they hold on to them in a rigid way. And so they never release. So if you can go to the next slide. So this is what I did with this board and stat leadership team group, is that we broke into 4 groups and talked about, you know, one was exploring, one was talking about launching, one was talking about sustaining, one was talking about release. I did this with a team, used just this one concept with a team for a foundation, and they were totally overworked and stretched. When I put them into 4 quadrants, they could figure out all kinds of stuff they wanted to explore, all kinds of stuff they wanted to launch, all kinds of stuff that they were sustaining, but they couldn't identify anything that they were willing to let go of. So no wonder they were totally stressed out. So this release is necessary in nature because it brings resources to then reinvest in the ongoing dynamic shifting of the system. So you have to release to unleash resources, time, effort, money, it doesn't matter what, in order to do the next cycle of the adaptive cycle. And so this kind of flow is really what makes your organization more resilient. And in strategy, then they started actively talking about this. And then it started shifting the way they thought. And then eventually what we did on the other side of that was we then did an affinity diagram. And what we did is we had a bunch of core questions. Like one of them was, what is the deepest intrinsic value that this organization has for its that it wants to move forward into the future? I mean, they were deeper questions than your traditional strategy questions. And you could see how the conceptual map had started pulling them into deeper ways of thinking about their organization, their strategy, their impact, how to get there. You can go to the next slide, Josie. So that's what we did, was kind of framed up the release. This was the hardest one for them to think about. Not unusual, but some organizations have a hard time here if they are too locked into their scarcity frame. Some is what happens, the old frame of you initiate 1 year, you problem solve the second year, you sustain the third year. What happens organizationally is that when you explore, launch, and sustain, you have a whole pile up every single year of more stuff to sustain. So without the release, pretty much your organization stops evolving. Okay, one more slide. So then this was the last piece that we went, and this was really about, the whole conceptual roadmap was about inviting, attracting, creating space to go to deeper questions to build the next iteration of strategy. So this is part of that. So this was initially framed off of Otto Schwarmer's Theory U. But then I had a client who started playing around with this column as a third column for Theory U, which is what deploys in the culture. So you can either hang out in the behaviors or events. That's kind of above the, if you can kind of think of this as a kind of a different ways of going deeper. You can do events and behaviors. You can react quickly. Oftentimes boards in relationship with staff, come in and say, what's going on here? And then the organization reacts. But what deploys in the culture or in the relationship between the board and the organization is impulse, which doesn't get you to any deeper, stronger, more patterns of strategy. Patterns of behavior are really used to predict. So we kind of analyze our stakeholders and what they want, and they say, oh, we want this. And so you respond in your organization in a more tactical level. The structures that restrict and bias behaviors, I would add processes as well, get you to design and advocate towards a different kind of way of thinking. But what deploys is that you're operating more on a strategic and programmatic level. But down here, this was where we wanted to get this group to move, was down here to the core values, mindsets, worldviews that anchor the behavior. And so we did it through conversation, discernment, dropping information into the system, evolution. And so what deploys with that whole crowd is stronger relationships and trust. So change down here at level 4 flows along lines of your relationship. So as you move through and start seeing the world differently through conversation and interaction, you walk out of the whole retreat with more deeper, authentic relationships and more trust in the system. So this was what was our last conceptual frame. And again, it was all designed to help them go deeper, question their thinking, question what is their highest possible purpose and contribution that they can bring. What is their unique gifts that they bring as an organization that meets the deep needs in their region and their community, which gets to purpose. So go one more. So, and I suspect all of you, knowing some of you as I do, all of you have your own list here. This was just, I was trying to leverage the power of limits. So basically, this whole part of the retreat, we also did things like we invited the leadership team to talk about things that they'd celebrated from the last 3 years that they had accomplished to help, again, bring more complexity and dynamic movement into the room. And then I asked the leadership team to actually generate a list of lessons learned from their day-to-day experience of working in this organization, because boards never understand the complexity the way the people who are working there full-time do. Never. And so how do you bring that complexity into the room? And one of the ways we did it is we invited the leadership team to come in and talk about what are they learning. So again, it was modeling a resilience characteristic of learning, but it was also, they brought more complexity into the room. And then more of the board members kept saying, oh, that's a complex thing, isn't it? And, kind of along this line that the job is easy, the people are difficult, or whatever that title was. So this is the experiment we ran. And so far, it looks like, we're the initial affinity diagram, we kind of gave them 8 questions. Every board member responded to all 8 questions. Then we broke into small groups and did the ordering in commonality, and then went through and talked about the question, what were the core themes under each. One of the questions was, what strategies do you think can help us move to the next level? And now the leadership team will massage that and bring it back to, with some iteration, to have a final vote in December. So we'll see how this work continues to shift the way they think and what they value over time. So that's the experiment.
Beautiful.
Thoughts?
Amazing. So, Kathy, are you okay if we hang on for, another 10 minutes if people want to jump on? I've been looking at the chat. What I've personally got out of this was, well, it's inspiring and practical at the same time. Like it's huge. Really elegant, practical questions. But I'm interested to know how it felt for you going through this. To see people actually, it's transformational, this approach, to participate in it, right?
Yeah, so first of all, I'm beginning to think that living systems, it's the small stuff you do, not the big stuff you do, that transforms the system. That's number one. So in sailing, the sailing metaphor is that you're always making these constant small adjustments that, as the wind shifts, you shift a little bit, you shift your weight, you shift whatever. So in this thing to watch, so the big experiment was whether, what's the smallest amount of information that could have the highest transformative effect in it, using the interdependence and complexity of the system. And so that was my kind of thought experiment in building out this frame. I wasn't trying to create every single conceptual frame that I thought would make a difference. I was really, nature has this concept as you tap the power of limits. So you're trying to figure out and always kind of wrestle with what are the simple core narrative through line that could fundamentally over time and relationship shift everything. So I think that's that was what was fun for me. The fact that I had this was my 3rd iteration, and some of the board members that had been in my first 2 facilitations were still there or had come back, or some of the people that were there in the 2nd iteration were showing up in the 3rd. That kind of relationship and trust in me as a human being made a huge difference in what was possible around what was shifting. So, you can't influence a system you're not in a relationship with. Same thing with people. And so this idea that consultants can come in without a relationship and have huge transformative effects, it just doesn't make any sense. So, you're always in this question of how do you show up? How do you enter into the relationship? And sometimes it's not in person. I'm working with a team in Africa. I've never physically been there in person. but we're now about a year and a half in to some work that we're doing there. And again, we use this theory U they were trying to figure out, how does leadership change when they go from a top-down, programmatically directed international development work to sustainable, locally led development, which turns from hierarchy to network, and from expert colonialism writ large to collaborative unleashing of the system, right? And so the person I'm coaching, who's the senior VP in that region, wanted me to create a curriculum for people to go through. But what we eventually ended up is this theory U frame, which is, let's just have a conversation and see who in your team already has deep wisdom about this that could be unleashed. And that simple shift allowed for local stuff to show up and start the conversation. So even though I wasn't in the room, they were in the room, something magical happened there. So to be a part of it is seriously fun, because this is part of the work that I'm supposed to be doing in the world, is to help accelerate this frame and but the CEO and I, we kind of have partnered before, and we trust each other, and I really respect his creative, innovative knowledge and wisdom and insight. So we're really good collaborators. And so it was really fun that we entered into this as an experiment, as opposed to a deliverable that had to be perfect.
Mm-hmm. Could I get a comment from Becky, and then Ed, you either comment, question, but Becky, you're sitting there smiling.
And well, I just enjoy listening to Kathy. So it's nice to see you, Kathy. I think what goes through my mind, so I'm approach things as a developmental psychologist. And so I think about the individual thinking capacities of, leaders can get stuck in the collective of thinking black and white. Then they kind of move into the individual thinking, but they'll see more systems and they can interact with those systems. And then it's quite a jump to get them back to the collective, to those underlying structures and assumptions. But what really struck me is that you've architected kind of conditions to allow those shifts to happen. I was really curious, how those architected processes might work if you did have a leader that was more in linear thinking, black and white, and could that container help them see the system? So that's the question.
In my individual coaching, that is a journey that we go on, is to help them move. Sometimes even people who are deeply enmeshed in the global South and a more indigenous point of view still can be infected by the global North and the hierarchy frame. And so helping them get rid of stuff and start trusting themselves is sometimes part of the process. One of the things I've learned from working with the Pachamama Alliance is that I started asking them how they teach systems thinking. I don't know if you know them very much, but they do a lot of they've been over 2 decades of immersion experiences in the Ecuadorian rainforest in partnership with an indigenous dream culture tribe there. And I asked them one time, I said, so how do you teach systems thinking? Because I have some friends in higher ed who believe that you can't teach systems thinking to undergraduates. They just can't. They just don't have the brain for it, which is, I don't agree with, but they've been having this debate for 4 years. So I asked my friend from the Pachamama Alliance, how did they do it? And they said, well, we don't teach people how to think in systems. We get them to feel the system. So all of a sudden, this whole conceptual map looks like it's conceptual as in brain, but the language and the descriptions and the metaphor invite the emotions into it, which you have to connect the emotions, the relationships, the concepts, because that shifts the relationships to a way that opens people up instead of locks people down. And sometimes even strongly linear people have aspects of disorder in their life. And so sometimes by shifting context, like to their teenage kids or their 2-year-old in the grocery store, or there are always things that people, because it's part of the human condition, that we have aspects of our life where we are in full open living system frames. So part of our work with people is to help try to figure out where is that space or example or experience that's lived inside of them that is so powerful. So I don't know, that's how I've intuitively shifted, but I love that frame, is that they feel the system, and when they feel the system, the brain will follow, basically, is how they would say it. They even have a name for it. It's called rainforest brain. It's when you are immersed in a system and you see all the connectivity in the system and you begin to see the wholeness of everything. The other thing is, I believe that human beings actually yearn for wholeness, greater and greater approximations of wholeness. And so that is an unstated but deep thing that many people yearn for. And so if you help them experience the wholeness, even if they're linear in their habitual defaults, they will start going some other place because they hope that there's another place other than this more dry linear frame.
Beautiful. Ed?
I love this. I love what you're doing. I love that you're using the language of living systems, because I don't think all systems as they are presented to us, theoretical systems, are actually living systems. They're just another versions of systems of control. And I really see that in my work in Africa. I work with people in 3 different countries there. And it's been very interesting because of what they teach me. I had the privilege of meeting with some women, this is 3 years ago, who were in a rural economic development program where they were being taught how to farm. And as we sat there, I said, "You're my teachers. I'm your student." I said, "Nobody in my family for 5 or 6 generations has farmed." And they just looked at me like, how do you live? And so they went through the process of showing me how they do their thing. Well, what I gained from that, and this is kind of what I got immediately from this, was how intrusive the colonial mindset is, not only in places like Africa or South America, but in the companies where people work here.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And so I decided that I would work from a framework where I would say, I'm interested in developing African organizations with African leadership and African money. And when I say that, this is typically when one of these people that I'm working with has asked me to pay for something, and many of them are very poor. And I said, if I start giving you money, you'll never develop, and you'll never grow. So you have to go and build these living systems right where you live. You have to build these relationships so that you can find a way to generate the income so that you all can live on your own. The farming women said, we want to be self-sufficient and interdependent. I said, so this is the idea of that was kind of, and I think this is embedded in everything that you're saying. And so
this is why the active hope, the emotional side of change and transformation, is so critical. And because if they're this is called passive hope. It's like they're waiting for somebody else to come in with money to solve what they see as the possible change in the system that's needed, but they won't develop it themselves. And so if they don't show up in a different way, it won't hold. I mean, you can get all the money you want, but it won't hold. So yeah, 100% agree. Lovely.
Maybe a final comment, Cass, if you're happy to jump on as a system sister. Oh, we can't hear you.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Kathleen. I loved it. I was familiar with a lot of the frameworks and models that you were using, but I really love the questions that you've taken from those, the elegance of those, and the ability to really shift the system by getting people to reflect on those. So yeah, wonderful. Thank you. And in relationship as well, in conversation and relationship.
Yeah, it's this goes to the subtlety of inviting the livingness, the humanness into our work. You know, so many of our contracts that negotiate our relationship and deliverables are concrete for the legal kind of system that we're working in, right?
Yeah.
And when you do this kind of magic, the deliverables are the very last thing that you pay attention to. That will happen organically almost.
Totally.
If you do the other parts.
Yeah, often with my work, I have to sell the deliverable, but that's not really what they're getting. So part of my work is I do a collaborative mapping of the system with people, but it's not about the map. Nothing's about the map. You know, it's just about the map actually helps people feel safe that they're doing something, that they're going to get a deliverable. But actually, it's about the conversations and the insight and the shifts that are happening through the process.
You know, nature design is it creates conditions conducive to the life of future generations. If nature had a purpose, that would be it. So I've also, as part of the partnering with the living system, I've also started asking that question. What are the conditions that are conducive to what we are hoping for? The fundamental deep transformation of the system. And then you start to say, okay, what's the lightest thing? What do I not need to be here for in order for the transformation to happen? Because you've set the conditions that will naturally kind of get you to a certain place. It just keeps going deeper, richer, more creative in the way you think about yourself and your relationship to the system.
Well, I would love to keep this going, but mayhem has been breaking out behind me. So I looked at the time, and we're cutting into your dinner time, Kathy, but thank you so much for the conversation. A lot of unanswered questions. We'll have to invite you back, of course.
I would love to come back anytime you invite me.
Just these beautiful
questions. I see you as thinking partners in this journey, and you know, every time we have a conversation together, I get something interesting and insightful, and I get certain reinforcements that I'm not crazy. So I really appreciate being in good company.
It's just beautiful. I mean, there's just so much that I'm going to have to take away and unpack out of, you know, these 90 minutes. And I'm really grateful to see that the world is inviting you in and other people in now to actually start to create some of these new things that we need, that we've known we've needed for a long time.
Yeah. And that's, I think, at the cusp of the work that we are being invited to show up in is, you know, how much of this do we already know, but we have forgotten because we've been courted and reinforced in a colonial kind of framework and a mechanistic framework instead of a living system framework. And then how do we bring that deeper wisdom or yearning that's embedded in many people, even if we don't see it, because they behave differently externally. But I think they still yearn for this other thing.
Yeah.
What happens when we connect with them as if they're yearning, but they can't say it or they can't recognize it, but they'll feel it when they experience it.
Yeah. But thank you so much. Enjoy your dinner. Those of you on the other side of the world, have a lovely day. Stay out of the rain for those of us in this part of the world, and look forward to the next time. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you
Bye.
very
Bye.
much.
You.